Before we get started tonight, I want to take a moment and acknowledge that MOHAI stands on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and all Coast Salish people. We acknowledge the forced displacement of Native communities from this land while honoring the endurance of the Duwamish people who still live here. To this day, the Duwamish people have yet to receive federal recognition. We encourage you to visit the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center in West Seattle to learn more. I also want to note that this program is taking place at the same time as unprecedented protests against the police violence towards Black people. These protests in our community, across the nation and really across the world, are a call to action for each of us to state unequivocally that Black lives matter. And MOHAI stands unfalteringly with those who are calling for justice now. Now tonight, for our very first Curators Lecture, it is my great pleasure to introduce MOHAI's own Curator of Collections, Clara Berg. Clara oversees the care of the museum's extensive collection of 3D artifacts and does research and presentations about its contents. In 2019, she curated MOHAI's exhibit, Seattle Style Fashion Function, which I'm sure some of you got to see, and we're thrilled to have Clara kicking off our Curators Lecture series tonight. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, Nicole. Switching on one of my other devices. There we go. Oh, no. Well, thank you all for joining this evening for this inaugural Curators Lecture, but I know some of you have been to previous talks of mine. So here we are in September in this very, very strange year that we're having. Some people think of September, well, we're about to be in October, which people like to think of as spooky season with Halloween on the way. And that's fitting for what I'm going to talk about tonight, because I think artifacts are kind of spooky things. I was once asked about my job, whether it creeps me out handling all of these things that once belonged to dead people. And I'd never really thought about it that way. And I don't really think I get creeped out by artifacts, but I do sometimes feel pleasantly haunted by them. I like the fact that objects can have a presence, and that when you know their stories, those stories can feel really powerful. In the academic world of history, people who get PhDs and teach at universities, they tend not to work with artifacts as much. Documents are good because they have a literal, they have literal writing on them that says things. And, photos can also be reliable ways to verify certain kinds of information. But artifacts can't always be read in the traditional sense. It's pretty rare to see an artifact cited in the footnotes of an academic paper or a book. But while artifacts aren't concrete like a document, they have a different kind of power. They evoke moments in time. They represent a person or an event or an era. They have a special way of making the past feel alive. They literally connect the past and the present. There's that weird reality of looking at something that was made or held or used by someone who's long gone. So that's what I mean by artifacts being sort of haunting. But they can also be sort of tricky. Stories about artifacts can be really difficult to verify. They rely on oral history and memories. People pass things down with stories, and sometimes it can be a long game of telephone with the story getting distorted over time. If anyone who's watched Antiques Roadshow knows those episodes where someone brings in this treasured family object and the appraiser tears the story apart in 5 minutes. What we have at MOHAI is the result of over 100 years of collecting. And like a lot of history collections, what we have is all the highs and lows of what 100 years of collecting can get you. So we have some powerful, potent stories that are well documented. We have some items with no apparent story that don't seem very interesting. We don't know why they were collected. And we have things with really interesting stories, but the stories are a little suspicious. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is those kind of suspicious stories. So I'm going to start with a great blend of that sort of questionable history with that kind of spooky artifact bit that I mentioned, and by talking about our Lincoln artifacts. And MOHAI wasn't always so strict about collecting things that were specific to Seattle and the Puget Sound region, so I am talking about Abraham Lincoln. So several of the Lincoln items we have, I would describe as relics. There are some religions who venerate relics, items from a saint, like a scrap of fabric or a lock of hair. There's also secular relics, a napkin that a celebrity touched, or people have pieces of the Berlin Wall. But the wild thing about relics is that without the story of the object itself is usually something that you might not think to save. We have in the collection a bag that is labeled viaduct rubble, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a bag with some cement chunks in it. So if it didn't have that label on it and it got lost, or if there was someone who isn't from Seattle, doesn't care about the viaduct, it's a bag of stuff that usually would get thrown away. So that's the weird thing about relics. So here's a couple of our Lincoln relics. On the left, what you're seeing is it's a paper card that's about 4 by 7 inches with a bunch of fabric scraps and buttons. According to the record, the fabric scraps are all bits of textiles from Lincoln's funeral. The fabrics were used to drape the coffin and the platform that the coffin sat on, and then the buttons belong to Mrs. Lincoln. The record says that all of these were given to someone named Mrs. Zern of Olympia from her grandmother, who was a personal friend of Mrs. Lincoln and got the buttons from her clothes, which I hope means that Mrs. Lincoln gave her the buttons and that this woman wasn't just stealing buttons from Mary Lincoln, when she felt like it. The piece of wood is described as a rail made by Lincoln himself in the winter of 1831 or 32 from a barn which belonged to someone named Mr. Campbell. So he helped build a barn, and that guy, I guess, broke up parts of this barn. And that Mr. Campbell was the half brother of Mrs. Zern's father's cousin. So both of those are a bit of a trail to follow. This is the kind of research that would be really hard to do. We don't have the name of Mrs. Zern. She's not the donor. So the donor said she got these from this woman named Mrs. Zern. So we don't have the first name of Mrs. Zern. We don't have her maiden name. So to track down her grandmother's name, let alone the half brother of her father's cousin, is quite a challenge. And even if we figured out who all these people were, would that prove that these items are what they say they were? That Abraham Lincoln had once worked on a barn that Mr. Campbell owned, and that he was the only one that worked on the barn, so we can guarantee that any piece of wood from that barn, had been handled by him. And that this grandmother would have known Mrs. Lincoln well enough to have received items from the coffin, from her own buttons. And if you have a painting that's allegedly by a famous artist, you can bring in an expert to try to verify the painting style or try to date the types of paints that were used. But buttons are mass produced. So buttons from Mrs. Lincoln's clothes are going to look like buttons from anyone else. And, we can confirm that this is a piece of wood, but confirming that it was a piece of wood that had been touched and carved by Lincoln himself, how could you ever know something like that with certainty? So big question marks. Less relic-y, more of an actual complete object, we have this pair of binoculars that allegedly belonged to Abraham Lincoln. When I was researching this at home, working from home, our digital records said that we had something in the paper file that verified this history. So once I was back in the office, I was thrilled to look this up, and indeed we do have some documentation with this. So essentially what it is a bill of sale from to the Alaska Yukon Pioneers Association, and someone who is part of that organization donated it to us. And there's information from the seller explaining the history of these glasses. So it says, these glasses were formerly the property of Abraham Lincoln. At his death, they were presented by Mrs. Lincoln to her sister, who in time presented them to her daughter, Miss Minnie Smith, in 1910. Miss Smith gave them to me, being an intimate friend of the family. So that's promising. Mrs. Lincoln did have a sister named Anne Marie Smith, who had a daughter named Minnie Smith Johnson. So that checks out. What isn't clear is who the me is. We have a signature, but that is it. I polled the rest of the staff about what they think this signature says, and you can also have your own opinions. The thing that got the most votes was Cooper, particularly after one of our archivists confirmed that the sort of flourish over the P that makes it look more like Coofer was more common in 19th and 20th century handwriting. But so but so if we're right about that, that's Cooper, how many Mrs. Coopers are there in Seattle, let alone in the country, since we're not totally sure this person was in Seattle who sold these binoculars? How would you begin to figure out which Mrs. Cooper was an intimate friend of the niece of Mrs. Lincoln? So, you know, this has better provenance, but still, I wouldn't say it's set in stone. But the most interesting Lincoln artifact we have by far, and I'm going to spend a little more time on it because it's so wild, is we have this lace scarf that, according to the record, is the very scarf that Mary Lincoln was wearing the night of the Lincoln assassination. And there's blood spots on it. So this is a pretty bold claim. Why would something of such national importance, but no Pacific Northwest connection, have ended up at MOHAI? So here's the actual catalog card from 1948. It says, large lace scarf, supposed to have been Mrs. Lincoln's, spots our blood from the assassination. Now, I think it's telling that whoever typed this up put quotes around that story. It seems like they were maybe a little skeptical too. Further debate seems to pop up on the donor card. So the person who typed it said, believed to have been owned by Mrs. Lincoln. And then there's some handwriting, which I'm concealing the name of the donor just because I'm poking a little fun at her tonight. So I, want to protect her. That it's the same penmanship that signed the donor card is also this one who wrote in, was owned by her, as if to clarify. So I'm sensing there was even a little tension in 48 when this was donated. I did do some quick research on the donor, and it wasn't very illuminating. Her last name was not Lincoln. There's not a really obvious way she would have ended up with something like this. She had immigrated to the US from England in 1919, and she was married to a man who came to Seattle in the late 19th century. So, I mean, it's possible, but there's not any kind of clear clue about why she would have had something like this. So how else could we verify something like this? Well, your first thought may be you get the blood spots tested. That turns out to be much harder than you might think. And as an example, the Chicago History Museum has a bloody cloak from the assassination that is still not conclusive, but has much better provenance than what we have. And they did a whole research project about this. So their cloak, the story of their cloak, and why it has a little bit more likely of a history than ours, is that Mary Lincoln had a dressmaker and stylist named Elizabeth Keckley. And Keckley wrote in her autobiography that she received a bloody cloak and a hat from Mrs. Lincoln from the assassination. Now, it's not clear how the cloak would have gotten from Keckley to Chicago. There's no documentation about that transfer, but at least we know that there was a cloak that existed. And so it then appears to have popped up in Chicago. I should say, by the way, that Elizabeth Keckley is a very interesting figure in her own right. She was born into slavery. She got her freedom, and then she became one of the most sought after seamstresses in DC. Her autobiography is called Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. So I recommend that to anybody who wants to learn more about her. But anyway, back to this cloak that they have in Chicago. So they did this whole study about the cloak, which this is just the first page of, and so you can go online. The website is chicagohistoryresources.org/wetwithblood. And they explained why DNA testing was not viable for their piece either. So one, at the time that they were doing it, and I believe this is still the case, that there's actually not a really good, reliable DNA profile of Abraham Lincoln to compare it to. Secondly, though, you would actually also need a DNA profile of a much less famous person named Henry Rathbone, who was in the box with the Lincolns during the assassination, and he was stabbed by Booth. He tried to keep Booth from fleeing. Rathbone survived, but he bled quite profusely at the scene. So if it's authentic to the Lincoln assassination, it actually could be Henry Rathbone's blood. But there's not a good DNA profile for him to compare to. Second, to get enough DNA from a spot on the cloak, you would have to cut a chunk of the cloak out, which is pretty much a huge no-no when it comes to a historic item, especially one if it turns out to be as significant as you think it is. And then even if you did make the choice to do that, Any other DNA on the cloak, like skin cells from anybody who's handled it in the last 150 years, could get mixed in as well that would ruin the sample. So they decided that was not realistic for their cloak, and I think it's even less realistic for our scarf. So with DNA testing out, the next thing is I tried to figure out sort of some other markers that might indicate if we're on the right track with the scarf. So I tried to figure out whether anything was known about what Miss Lincoln was wearing that night, other than what I mentioned with the bloody cloak. Of course, 100 years later, Jackie Kennedy, everybody knows what she was wearing during the Kennedy assassination, but that's an era of photography and film. And that while photography had been invented in the Civil War, there's actually no known photographs of Mary Lincoln that night. There were, however, illustrations that were made and sold popularly at the time. And as you can see, they don't really seem to agree on what she was wearing. So it also indicates that there wasn't like everybody sort of knew what she was wearing that night. And there was, we're seeing different things in the image, but we also are not seeing a lace scarf in either case of these two images. There's actually a heavier cloak that she seems to be, or heavier scarf that she seems to be wearing. And there are some firsthand accounts that mention her clothing, but they also conflict. They don't agree. So it's not like everyone's talking about the lace scarf and where did it end up. As far as we know, there's no record of something like that existing. So the next thing I researched was what were the scarf fashions from this period? Was this an appropriate accessory for 1865? And if you're wondering, that actually is a relevant question when it comes to Mary Lincoln, because she was very interested in fashion. She liked being up to date with her wardrobe, and she actually spent a lot of money on her wardrobe. In fact, too much money. According to Elizabeth Keckley, Mary Lincoln was in about $70,000 worth of debt when her husband died. And Keckley commented that the fact that the president died in ignorance of this fact was the only happy feature of the assassination. So this image is the scarf folded in half, and we know that it was folded in half when it was stained because of the pattern of the stains. They match up when it's folded. So this, presumably, if this was what it says it is, this is how it would have been worn. When it's unfolded, it's about 50 by 44 inches, so not quite square, but roughly square. Folded this way, it's about 50 by 22, so the idea, if it was indeed worn for the assassination, it would be worn long ways and then either sort of around the neck or around the shoulders. So this type of long rectangular scarf, also plain in the center with decorations around the outside, would have been a little old-fashioned by the 1860s. The best comparison I was able to find is just a close-up of a piece that the Met has. You can see sort of a similar plain center to the piece and then decorated around the border. And this is dated to around 1825 or 1830. More in fashion at the time of the Civil War were large triangular, densely decorated lace pieces like this one that the Met has in white, but black was also very fashionable. Here's two women with these large triangular Chantilly lace shawls. So again, our scarf isn't quite on the mark as far as what would have been the most fashionable kind of lace piece to wear to the evening for a play. So based on all this evidence, because sort of it really didn't hit any of the marks, I would say that I'm between 90 and 99% sure that this is not authentic. But what's relevant to know is that this hunger for Lincoln relics began almost as soon as he died, actually basically as soon as he died. When Lincoln was shot, he was taken across the street to a boarding house owned by a man named William Peterson. And when Lincoln died and his body was removed, people rushed into the house and began tearing up the sheets and the floorboards to have mementos of the president's death. At first, Peterson tried to push people out, but he eventually saw it as a business opportunity and charged admission and had hundreds of visitors every day. So the fact that a museum in Seattle ended up with so many Lincoln objects also convinces me that a lot of people had this stuff, and whether it was authentic or not. There was an active trade in Lincoln objects all over the country. And so I don't think it's that much of a stretch to think that somebody was making fake ones. You know, hopefully it's animal blood or maybe it's not even blood, that would be good, and passing it off as a Lincoln relic to somebody. So now I'm gonna move on to alleged firsts in the collection. The study of firsts history seems to be obsessed with the idea of being first. The first person to do this, the first person to invent this. And it's especially true in our relatively young country, and certainly Seattle is even a pretty young city. And when we talk about, who arrived, what settlers arrived here first and who built a home where first. And some museum visitors also expect to see these kind of stories in a museum. I have a colleague in the education department at MOHAI who once told me that she saw a chaperone walking around with her school group, pointing to everything she saw as the first in Seattle. So if she saw a chair, she told the kids that was the first chair in Seattle. She saw a hat, she said that was the first hat in Seattle. And that was every artifact she saw. That was how she was describing it. So that's something that's kind of, people think that's what they're going to see at a museum. So we have allegedly the first piano in Seattle. And this is a pretty bad photo. It's a lot grainier than some of the other photos, so I apologize. So the records we have on it say this is Seattle's first piano, brought here in the late 1870s by Mr. David Kellogg as a gift to his wife. I was able to find a 1945 article in the Seattle Times that talked about David and Anna Kellogg and their home, and it repeated the claim that they had the first piano, but they put the date closer to 1883, so a little bit later. Well, it didn't take me very long to figure out that this probably is not true. There's a book called Before Seattle Rocked, A City and Its Music, and Kurt Armbruster, who's the author, said the first piano in Seattle turned up in 1856. And that piano instruction was being offered at the University of Washington as early as 1862. So this is 1870s, early 80s. So it's off by quite a bit. One thing that's interesting was this article that I mentioned in 1945 that also claimed this was the first piano. It was part of a series on old Seattle families and old Seattle mansions. And the Kellogg's also claimed that they had the first tennis court in Seattle. But the author of the article noted that a couple weeks ago when he had interviewed the Carkeeks had also claimed that they had the first tennis court in Seattle. So, and sort of then the author was saying, so the families can settle it amongst themselves. So this is also like, these are the kinds of families in Seattle who are claiming as many firsts as they can, it seems like, and some of them conflict. So speaking of tennis, we also have allegedly the first tennis rackets in Seattle. So the information on the card says that these are 2 tennis rackets, first in Seattle, belong to Dad Edwards. So the problem with this is that we don't know the donor. Whose dad is Dad Edwards? This missing donor information was common with some of our earliest artifacts. So the Seattle Historical Society was founded in 1914, and from then until the 40s and 50s, when when the museum was being built, a lot of these things were kept in people's homes. And the documentation system was probably a little inconsistent, and by the time things made it to the museum, once the museum was being built, some of the information had gotten lost. So that's why we think a lot of our early donors, we have a lot of unknown donors in our early acquisitions. So I tried to do a little research about other donors we had whose last name was Edwards, and see if anyone was a logical match for this story. So for one, there was one that I thought I was maybe onto something, but then I discovered that her parents, the donor's parents, so her most likely Dad Edwards, had come to Seattle in 1900, which was 10 years after the founding of the Seattle Tennis Club. So there's no way that the club was around for 10 years before anyone thought to bring a tennis racket. Take a sip of water, sorry. So next I did a search in the Historic Seattle Times for first tennis racket. And came up with a 1927 article about a lecture at the Seattle Tennis Club about the early days. And it says that Mr. Bernard Pelly, one of the founding members of the club, presented to the club as a memento of those early days, the first tennis racket in the Northwest, which he brought from England in 1882. Mrs. Charles Rollins had a similar racket, which came from Boston 2 years later. Well, that seemed promising for a minute because these are Harvard brand, and so realistically probably from Boston. So I thought maybe Mrs. Charles Rollins, her maiden name was Edwards, maybe these are her rackets. Looked it up, no dice. Her maiden name was Thompson, doesn't appear to be the same. So almost on a whim, I searched the Seattle Times for Dad Edwards to see if that was maybe someone's nickname. And it turned out it was. John W. Edwards, known as Dad Edwards, not clear why, other than I believe he was somebody's father, He was born in Ottawa in 1836 and came to Puget Sound in 1867. He was known as a sportsman and an outdoorsman of many interests, but his main one seems to be trap shooting. I didn't find any reference to tennis, but a lot of sort of general sporty outdoors people at this time, almost everybody played tennis if you had the leisure time. So he came to Seattle in, as I said, 1867, which is pretty early. So if he brought these tennis rackets with him when he arrived, that does predate what the Seattle Tennis Club claims as the first rackets. But we also don't have a date for these. So we don't know if he brought them when he arrived or he brought them back after a trip. So there's really very, very little information to go on for these rackets. Next up, I really enjoy this one. This is the alleged first zipper in Seattle. And I remember when we found this one in the collection because I was out working in the conservation lab and I just heard these peals of laughter coming from my coworkers in the office. I think it was the odd wording of the original record and it being late in the day and being a little punchy. So you probably won't crack up quite as much as we did, but it's still a little bit funny. So this is the description says, heavy black zipper. Donor says zipper was on a suit she purchased in Seattle in 1906. She understands this was the first zipper, but there was an agreement that no more were to be made for 20 years. So that is really a weird story. The idea that they put a zipper on a suit, but then decided not to do it again for 20 years, like what, the story doesn't make any sense. So, but researching this item led me to learn some interesting things about the history of zippers. And actually about this object in particular. So technically this is not a true, this is the card that I read. So this is not a true zipper. It's actually a man named Whitcomb L. Judson, who is not from Seattle, so this is a national story. He patented a series of sliding locking fasteners. The first version he made was in 1891, and this is his 1905 version. And on the right, you can see the patent drawings. And hopefully you can see in the close-up that this really doesn't quite look like zippers that we're used to today. There's a series of hooks on one side, and there's a series of loops on the other. So apparently Judson's fasteners never quite caught on because they had a tendency to, quote, break open unexpectedly, which is not what anybody wants in a fastener. He died in 1909, he never quite cracked it. So it was another inventor who kind of built on his basic idea and made the first true zipper that didn't randomly pop open. So we do have this, so this is a very early version of a sliding fastener. Certainly not the first ever in history, and I would say it's nearly impossible to say that this was literally the first one in Seattle. I think what's fascinating about this artifact, and it really kind of highlights with the other two firsts that, we can't really tell our first, or the piano we know is not the first, is that people seem to have this idea that the first one that they see or use is the first one ever. And the whole thing about the zipper not being used then again for 20 years, it probably means that this donor didn't see another sliding lock like this on clothes for about that long. And it did take a while for zippers to catch on. Some people thought they were kind of cheap or low class. And so even though there were sliding locks existing in between, this particular person may have not seen them on any clothes for about 20 years. And she made an assumption that that was the case for everybody. We have another item in our collection that has some Velcro on it, and the person who wore it told us that it was the first Velcro in a garment ever. And when I asked him a little more about that, he admitted that it was the first Velcro that he had ever worn, and so he assumed that it was the first ever. So I think that's also what's going on with a lot of our donors. So that obsession with firsts is also kind of a cultural thing. And I think it has to do with how many of us in America are taught history. We often have this idea of America or of our city as kind of starting with a blank slate, which of course ignores native stories and innovations, and sort of prioritizing those firsts of sort of the white men and women who are arriving here and building the nation or building the city, and sort of starting from zero, and then everyone gets to be first when they arrive or what they do first. It also tends to prioritize individual accomplishments over often more complex stories. which may involve a lot of people and a lot of nuance. My background is fashion history, and this is something that we wrestle with a lot, is there's people who like to say that major fashion items were invented by this or that designer. And the most famous examples being Chanel inventing the little black dress, Mary Quant inventing the mini skirt, and then closer to home, we have Eddie Bauer inventing the down jacket. And in all of those cases, the person mentioned created a version of that thing which was particularly popular or noticeable by the public, and they did a lot to further that style. But black dresses of a simple shape and style existed long before Chanel. Many designers and just cool girls in London were shortening their skirts in the early 60s, in which Mary Quant was picking up on. And Eddie Bauer combined influences and ideas from multiple sources to create his iconic down jacket. So, but that all isn't sort of good soundbite history. We really want that soundbite or that moment that changes, that single moment that changes everything versus what's much more common, which is kind of a blob of nuance, which is much less marketable. Sometimes though, those blobs of nuance, rather than clear facts, can be kind of interesting. One thing I really love about using artifacts to tell history is that they can evoke feelings and emotions in different ways than a document or a photo can. So one of our most important early artifacts at the museum is the Petticoat Flag. And it relates to an 1856 event known as the Battle of Seattle, which occurred between local Native people and a militia of local settlers who were supported by a US ship called the Decatur. Native people were fighting because of the intense pressure and coercion to sign away land rights and move to reservations. The battle itself lasted one day, but the repercussions lingered. Seattle historian Murray Morgan did not describe it as a victory for the American settlers, instead writing that both sides were dismayed, the whites by the realization that the Indians would really attack them, and the Indians by their first experience with exploding shells rather than cannonballs. So this is an important event in Seattle's history, and I'm not able to get into all the details of it tonight. But instead, I'm going to talk about the Petticoat Flag as an artifact which evokes a scene and a feeling. It transports you to a moment in time. During the battle, most of the white settler women and children took shelter in a blockhouse, and as shown in this painting. The story about the flag is that while they waited and worried, they tore up their petticoats and sewed a large American flag. It was made to hang vertically, which is how I'm showing it right now. But if you've seen it at the museum, and you know it's a very old artifact, so we have to show it flat, and so it appears backwards to us. So of course you can interpret this message as a message of patriotism, or as sort of a manifest destiny thinking of sort of staking claim to this area. But it also evokes this very relatable emotion of anxiety and boredom mixing together, and a need to just do something to pass the time, to take your mind off an extremely frightening situation. After September 11th, the satirical website The Onion remarkably found ways to make jokes about the situation that were relatable and cathartic rather than tasteless. And one of the most famous was, "Not knowing what else to do, woman bakes American flag cake," with the article explaining that Christine Pearson of Topeka, Kansas was feeling helpless and overwhelmed and needed something to take her away from the TV. And I think that a lot of us who lived through that time can relate, and people today, I mean, people are baking, people are crafting, and it's a mix of sort of anxiety and needing to do something. And so I find that to be a very relatable part of the Petticoat Flag story. Like a lot of artifacts, it's nearly impossible to 100% verify this story, although in this case, the evidence is pretty strong. It came to the museum via the granddaughter of Seattle founders David Denny and Louisa Boren. And the materials all check out as the types of fabrics that women would have had on hand at the time: red wool flannel, white and blue cotton, and there's a little bit of patterned cotton that I'll show you in a minute. Most undergarments at this time would have been white, but it isn't out of the question to have a color or a pattern. So that could be either a higher cost, or that something was being reused from an old garment and made into an undergarment. There was a fashion about a decade later for red flannel petticoats, but red flannel was a popular color for men's shirts on the frontier, so it was a popular fabric to buy and to have around. There's no seams on the stripes, so while it's possible that it was cut up men's shirts, it would be a little hard to achieve that, these long red lines. So either it is yardage or possibly reinforcing the idea of petticoats, because that would have been longer strips of fabric. My favorite part of the flag are the little loops for hanging, which are made of just a little bit of patterned cotton that very much does look like a mid-19th century cotton. So it's hard to say if these are really made literally from petticoats or just from fabrics that they would have had around. There are firsthand accounts from the blockhouse, which also, I should say that people stayed in the blockhouse for several days leading up to the battle, and then also afterwards, not knowing if there'd be continued fighting. And so people spent a lot of time there. There was sewing going on, and it was also very dark inside. So one firsthand account of someone doing some sewing, we don't necessarily know if it was about the flag, saying that her eyes would get so tired that sometimes she would close them and try to do her stitches by feel. So tired eyes and dark conditions also accounts for the fact that some of the stitches are a little clunky on the flag. Some of the stitches you're seeing here are conservation stitches, but the kind of straight stitches, a lot of women at the time, would have been capable of much finer hand stitching than this. It's not totally straight. There's some kind of wonkiness, which does reinforce that the idea that it was in a dark space, or people were tired, people were anxious. So that kind of checks out. People connect to history in different ways. Some people really love military history and battles. And in traditional European and American academic history, there's a big focus on great men and movements of troops. And that kind of history is really well supported by documents and newspaper articles and written accounts. But artifacts tend to rely on oral tradition, which a lot of historic, sort of Eurocentric history has ignored until recently. And the study of material culture, such as artifacts, often tells those stories of people who weren't included in other accounts, what life was like for women, for the poor, for people of color, for everyday people who have never been named in a history book. But artifacts tell the story of what they were touching and what they were making and what they were experiencing. And so for these reasons, I'm okay if sometimes we can't verify every fact and detail about an artifact, because we can present the information that we have and what we know, and then share the story that is told about it. But if you avoid displaying artifacts unless you can corroborate every claim with a more traditional source, like a document, you will continue to leave the same people out of history again and again. So take, for example, this fabulous gray coat. If you saw the Seattle Style exhibit last year, hopefully you recognize this. This was on display. It was donated about 20 years ago, and this is the information that came in with it. This coat belonged to and was made by Clara B White, who owned and lived in the duplex at 729 and 731 22nd Avenue in the Central District of Seattle. She was a seamstress and was one of the first African-American women to own property in Seattle. Now, the interesting thing about this donation is that the donor was not Clara White herself or a relative. It was the person who purchased the home from White's son in 1996. Clara White had passed away in 1994. Usually, home buyers don't end up with stuff from the previous owner. So this indicates to me that either this buyer was friends already with Clara White or with her son, and so had a relationship with the family, or that the house had maybe been purchased as is, and there had been items left behind, and she was kind of piecing this story together. Included with the coat was a stack of address labels and seamstress labels and a photo of Clara White with 2 unnamed children. The coat itself has no label, so that could be cause to question if she really made it or not. Then again, at least one of the labels, the text is sort of made for you. It's sort of as a gift. So she may not have put her own labels in garments. She knew that she had made it. There's also this interesting claim that she was one of the first African-American women to own property in Seattle. So another first claim. So I dug in a little bit on ancestry, and I was able to find that Clara Bell White was born about 1897 in Texas and came to Seattle in the 1920s or 30s. In the 1940 census, she's living at this address with her husband, Merson White, and the census information says that he owns the house. They divorced in 1945, and it appears that she then got to keep the house. So while in 1945, there were certainly a lot of barriers for Black people to own property and additional barriers for women, that is still awfully late to claim that she was among the first Black women to own property in Seattle. It may have been uncommon, but it's really a stretch to say that she's among the first in 1945. When we included this coat in the Seattle Style exhibit, I had a lot of trouble assigning a date to it. In shape, it's closest to the 1950s silhouette, a small waist, a big skirt, but the types of the fabrics used, and including the red polyester lining, which you couldn't see when it was on display, and you can see on this slide, and some of the embellishments read to me actually as a little more 1980s or even 1990s. One thing we do know about her is that she was very active at her church, the First African Methodist Episcopal, which is the oldest Black church in the state, and there is documentation for that. She taught Sunday school for over 60 years and even had a wing of the church named after her. So if I had to guess, I would say this was a coat to wear to church. It's sort of appropriately grand and dressy for church, but it's also not overly showy or gaudy. It's got a refined color palette. So, and since she made it herself, it reflects more of her personal style than, a trend that was, hot in the stores at the time. The presence of the garment labels does seem to corroborate the story that she was a seamstress, but with only one garment to go on, it's very hard to tell what that really means. Was this a full-time business that she ran? Was it supplementary income, or was it a hobby that was unpaid? Was she designing the clothes that she made? Was she an expert pattern maker who could replicate things from a drawing or a photo? Was she following patterns that you could purchase? We really don't know. I should say, though, we should resist the temptation to add different values to those options. The idea, I think, we have that she would be the most important if it was a full-time business and she was the designer. We know, at least from the coat, that she was an expert sewer. And sewing is no easy skill if you've tried it. And I like to think about it like this, that fashion designers are like composers. Sewers are like instrumentalists and singers. Some people do both, but you can be an exquisite musician and not write your own stuff. So too, you can be an expert sewer and not be a designer. But because we had so many questions about Clara B White's life and work, this coat almost didn't make the cut into the exhibit, because the other things in that section we knew so much more about. Some of them were contemporary, so we literally asked the designers about their businesses and about their practices. And we also had things from white male designers who'd been profiled in the local papers, which Clara White never was. But fortunately, we made the call to include it, and I'm glad we did, because I'd rather share part of the history than not share it at all. In his famous book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, historian James Lowen says that history is often the least favorite subject for a lot of high school students because it's often taught in this very flat way. Just names and dates and events to memorize. It's presented as if it's all already written in stone. As the title of the book implies, much of his focus is on incorrect information that's provided in textbooks. But he also talks a lot about finding different ways to approach history and engage students. Even if you're providing correct information, you need to leave room for the exploratory part of history. One of my favorite parts of that book is this table where he shows all of the evidence for journeys to and from the Americas prior to Columbus. So things like Viking explorers, but also things like hard to explain similarities between pottery and fishing styles in Japan and Ecuador. And some art in Central and South America that looks distinctly African. And laying out each of these with an explanation of what kinds of evidence we have, how historians have ranked those pieces of evidence in terms of reliability, and then asking students to discuss it. What connections are interesting to them? What do they see as reliable evidence? And those are the kinds of conversations that spark interest, the what ifs and the maybes, and this idea that history isn't a closed book that you just have to memorize. It's open to explore and experience and discover. Museums have a duty to present correct information, but we don't have to do it in a cold, dull way. We can share the facts, but we can also leave space for wonder and imagination, starting with what is known, but then asking what is possible. That's where history becomes exciting and adventurous. So I'm closing with this shell goblet because it's one of the collection staff's favorite artifacts because it is just so weird. It's covered in shells, but then has one single, very creepy glass eye. It came with information that said it was made by a Washington State pioneer. but we don't have any more information than that. So if you're trying to tell a story of Seattle and founding and important events, it really doesn't tell us much about Seattle history. What it does instead is raise questions. Why did someone make this? Where did they collect the shells? Why did they include this eye? Where did it come from? Was it from a doll? Why just the one eye? Was it part of a set? Did the person who made it find it humorous as well? Or was it meant to be weird and unsettling? Or did it have a more powerful message that we're not hearing? The most exciting artifacts are the ones that make us feel something and want to know more. Even if the story of the artifact is weird or questionable or vague, we can still learn something from the questions that they raise. So that is the thought that I'm going to leave you with tonight. But speaking of questions, I'm going to turn it back to Nicole to open the Q&A and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Clara. You've already got me thinking about those kinds of strange stories and cool artifacts that every family has in our home. I'm posing a lot more questions about those. We have a couple of questions already in the Q&A box, but I want to invite everybody online. Go ahead and post any questions that you would like to hear from Clara, and we'll get those posed and answered. We had a few questions, Clara, about the letter that showed up early in your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was about the significance of the Alaska Yukon Pioneers letterhead.
Yes, I can. Hopefully it won't give you vertigo to flip back through all these. Almost there. So many Lincoln artifacts.
Very early in the presentation.
Yeah, I know, very early. I have so many slides. Here it is. So that's actually another unanswered question. So the Alaska Yukon Pioneers Association, I think, was people. It was kind of I don't know if I would call it a fraternal organization. It was not like the Masons. I don't think they were like had rituals and things. I don't know. But it was people who I think had gone to the Yukon, and so it was kind of a fraternal group. And so it was one of the members of this group that donated the binoculars to us. So that's another question of whether they actually don't know that there is a date, 1939, and then we would have gotten this, I think this is probably from the 50s. So, why they were collecting and purchasing items, and then why this member of this organization then had ownership to donate it to us. I think he maybe said he donated, I'm trying to remember on the card, if it was donated on behalf of the organization or if he other than had membership somehow. But again, that is there's a little bit of a unclear link as to why they were collecting it and then why it then later was donated to us. Am I paused? I lost Nicole.
You're still there.
Okay, I'm still there.
So let's go to, there's another question actually about this letter, about the green ink.
Oh.
So I'm surprised that I think it's kind of reminiscent of, to me, 90s gel pens almost, this shade. So tell us more if you know about the green ink.
I don't know specifically. I mean, we have other things, of course. Anyone who's gone to a previous talk of mine knows that I like talking about John Doyle Bishop, who is a store owner in Seattle. And in the 50s, starting in the 50s, but up until the 70s and 80s, green ink was like his signature. So I think, we think of black and blue as classic, but certainly in the 20th century, when people weren't typing things, you had a little flourish. People used green ink, they used blue ink. I don't know if I've seen purple ink, but I mean, anything you can mix, any ink colors that exist, you can have pens that do that. So again, we don't know much about Mrs. Cooper, so we don't know why she was picking green, although it looks very nice with the letterhead. So maybe it was an aesthetic choice, but people had fun colors.
Oh, somebody in the chat says that they have a green Sharpie that's like this, so it continues on.
Yeah.
Another question is somebody would like to know the name of the book that included David and Anna Kellogg's, the claim that David and Anna had the first piano. I was wondering if you know the name of what that book is and if it's in the MOHAI collection.
Oh, so that was not a book. That was that was an article from the Seattle Times. And so anyone, this is also though a great resource, although it's my number one research secret. So you can learn everything about history that I know, is that if you have a Seattle Public Library card, you can access the Historic Seattle Times as a resource online. You go to Seattle Public Library website, it's like other resources and magazines and newspapers, and you just have to type in your card barcode, and then you can search the whole history of the Seattle Times from 1895 to the present, and it's word searchable. So I forget exactly what I searched. I think I may have searched for the Kellogg's, and I got this article, 1945 article about the house and about David and Anna Kellogg. But that is one of my favorite resources. So anyone who likes any kind of research Seattle history, go to the Historic Seattle Times. It's word searchable. There's so much interesting stuff in there.
Great. Another question about the Alaska Yukon Pioneers group. At one time, were they going to open their own museum?
That's a good question. I don't know, but also, what was the mission of their museum if they were collecting Abraham Lincoln's binoculars? What did Abraham Lincoln have to do with the Yukon? They may have had some kind of display case. It's true that, that MOHAI opened as a museum in 51 or 52. And so we had the Seattle Historical Society, there was a Pioneers Association. So there wasn't a history museum at this time in the 30s. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that I think there were probably a lot of small history focused organizations that were sort of doing collecting, whether they intended it to be a museum or, the history of museums is sort of the cabinet of curiosities model, which is, people showing off cool stuff they have in their house. And so the idea of, that as you're a member of this club, you can come see the Lincoln binoculars and it would be private and, here they have it in the case or something. So it could be a museum or just kind of the club collecting cool stuff that then, one of the perks of being in the club was getting to see cool stuff.
It's a great perk. We have another book question. Could you repeat the name of the book about seamstress in the White House after being a slave?
Yes. So the name is Elizabeth Keckley, Keckley. And let me go back in my notes and see if Elizabeth Keckley, which also the last time I was at the Smithsonian with the Hall of First Ladies, the dress that they had for Mary Lincoln, they attributed to Elizabeth Keckley. So she's definitely very much a known quantity, very famous. Gosh, I have this print so big, so just like so many pages of this. I just want to make sure I get the name. Okay, so it's called Behind the Scenes, not to be confused with my program Behind the Seams, actually Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 in the White House, 4 years in the White House. Elizabeth Keckley, Keckley.
Excellent. We have time for just a couple more questions. So if you have that last burning question that you've been holding on to, please put it in the Q&A box. And while we're giving you that last chance, I just want to know, Clara, so there were a lot of fun and weird things you found. What was the most to you intriguing that your research, you're like, wow, I really did not expect that. Beyond the eyeball in the cup, I think that might get, the award for the weirdest.
I guess, I don't know if this is not quite answering your question, but so I cut out, but I will admit now that I've been fascinated by this scarf for a very long time. I actually first sort of discovered it again, but then that makes me like, I wasn't the first to discover it, many people. But I first encountered it when I was actually interning at MOHAI before I went to grad school. And the staff, MOHAI staff at the time, had sort of the same attitude about it, of like, it's unlikely that this is what it says it is. But it sort of blew my mind of this bizarre claim. And so I actually spent so long talking about it tonight because I did a whole research paper when I was in grad school for fashion history to sort of, go through all of these things and figure out how, from sort of a fashion perspective, could we verify or learn more about this? And so that was when I read all these accounts of the Lincoln assassination and all of these stories about it. And, did anyone know what she had worn, and, the history of the styles. And then, I read part of Elizabeth Keckley's biography or autobiography about it. And so I think it's just, so I particularly just really love this artifact because I think it is, I almost considered concluding with it because I think similarly with the weird cup, we could just kind of write it off as, oh, it's a fake, that's stupid. But I think it's so fascinating of like, what is the story of this donor that was, what was the story that was told to her that she believed it so clearly? Was it someone who was selling fake Lincoln relics, or was it, from a family member who had kind of was it, they had sort of misunderstood the story, or that it was from a play, but then it got turned in, what, I think the idea of like, how did this thing come to us with this story that we're pretty sure is untrue, but also like, I don't know that it's 100% impossible that this is, there's like that little slim chance that this is what it says it is, and it ended up here at the museum, and isn't that wild? So I think that's what's kind of fun about it, is that like, even if it's fake, there's still so much story there of like, what even what happened with this thing? Like, what is the story? How did it get this story attached to it? So that's, the artifact I just think is like so cool.
Well, thank you so much for sharing it with us. I definitely learned a lot, and I always appreciate, Clara, how much you bring to light all the amazing things within the MOHAI collection. And I'm sure everyone out there is thinking of their own home artifacts in a new light too. So that is bringing us to the end of our time this evening. But never fear, you can learn more about local history by visiting the MOHAI Library. We have lots of resources available online during these pandemic times, including hundreds of historic photos. So I highly encourage you to take some time, go look through them. And then we also would love to see you back in this digital Zoom realm on Thursday. We've got yet another fantastic program. This one's going to be hosted by Sharon Williams, and it will feature community members advocating for a stronger democracy. And then lastly, if you learned something new or enjoy the work we are doing during this unprecedented time in history, please consider making a gift or becoming a member to support future programs and help sustain the museum beyond this unforeseen closure. And we're very much looking forward to seeing you in person again someday. But in the meantime, we are so glad that you could join us here on Zoom. And as you exit, you will see our donation page pop up in the web browser. And also, please visit mohai.org to see the rest of our programs, and have a good evening, and stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.